Hi everyone, this is a quick tutorial about what a quadratic equation really is. So let's get started. Now, a quadratic equation is an equation in the form of y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, okay? And the important thing to note is that in this equation, a here cannot equal 0. Because think about it, if a equals 0, then 0 times x squared is just going to make it 0. So this term would just cancel out. And that would leave us with bx plus c, and this just becomes a linear equation. So it's important that a does not equal 0. Now when I graph a quadratic, it looks something like this. This shape we get, we call it a parabola. Okay, a parabola. Let me write that here. Parabola. Now, it's important for us to know a few different elements of this graph. So the first thing is the points where this graph intersects the x-axis. These points are known as the x-intercepts. Okay, so that's very general. Where it intercepts or intersects the x-axis is known as the x-intercept. Or it could be called the roots of the equation, or the zeros of the equation. And zeros because this is the point where y is 0. At these points, y equals 0. So it's called either the zero, the roots, or the x-intercept. They all mean the same thing. The next point we need to know about is this point here. This is the point where the graph intersects the y-axis, and that is known as the y-intercept. The y-intercept. Okay, this point here we call the vertex. Now, if the graph opens upwards like the one here, then we say that we have a minimum. And if it opens downwards, then we say that we have a maximum. Okay, so to find the minimum and the maximum, the process is exactly the same. But what really changes this is a. If a is a positive number, so let me just write that. If a is positive, so greater than or equal to 1, because remember it cannot be equal to 0. So if a is greater than or equal to 1, then it opens upwards and we get a minimum point because the graph cannot exceed below this point. And if a is less than or equal to -1, then it opens downwards and we get a maximum point, okay? So I'll make a video in the future explaining how to find the minimum and maximum point. But just for now, know that if a is greater than or equal to 1, then it's a minimum. If it's less than or equal to -1, then we get a maximum. So the vertex, the line that goes through this vertex, sorry, I have to make that straight. The line that passes through this vertex here is known as the axis of symmetry. Symmetry. And that's because on either side of this line, the graph is symmetrical. It's almost like a mirror image because it cuts the graph exactly at its vertex. And the equation for the axis of symmetry is actually -b/2a. So what this means is in this equation here, whatever my value of b is, I just substitute that here and I get it, and I have to put a negative in front of it. So a -b/2 times the value of a. And that will give me the equation for the axis of symmetry. Now, how do I find out what these x-intercepts or roots of the equation are? And there's actually quite a few ways to do this. The first one is known as factoring. And this is when I set my y to be equal to 0. So if I want to find the x-intercept, I have to set my y to be 0. And if I want to find the y-intercept, I have to set my x to be 0. So again, a quadratic equation is in the form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where a cannot be equal to 0. So if I'm trying to find out my values of x, then I will have to substitute this y to be 0. Because again, going back to this graph, the point where at the x-intercepts, y is 0, right? It intersects at the x-axis, and exactly at the x-axis, y is equal to 0. That's why we set the equation to be 0. So we say 0 equals, and then the quadratic equation follows. And then we solve for x. Now I will have a future video explaining this. So for now, I'm just going to go through the different methods to solve it. The next one is known as completing the square. And when we complete the square, we get our equation in something known as the vertex form. The vertex form, okay? The third method is known as graphic. So basically, just by looking at the graph, I can say that the intersection point here is about -0.5, and here it's somewhere a little less than +2.5. So just looking at the graph, we can determine the method, and if you have a graphing calculator, it makes it all the more easier. So graphically is another method. And finally, we have something known as the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula is -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And this will give us the value of x. Now again, this can look a little bit daunting, but if you look here, all we have to do is substitute the values into the formula, and that will give us the values of x. Now it will give us the values and not the value, because if you look here, we have a positive and a negative square root. So whenever we take the square root of a value, we have to get the positive and the negative answer. Now -b plus the square root over 2a will give us one value of x, and -b minus this whatever is under the square root over 2a will give us the other value of x. So this will give us both the interceptions. This part under the square root, this part under the square root is known as the discriminant. Now again, don't worry, do watch my future videos where I'll explain each of these concepts in detail. But for now, just know that the different ways we can find the x-intercept are through factoring, completing the square, graphically, and using the quadratic formula. Thank you.